Everyone remembers the Magnificent Seven as a heroic Western legend, but few ever stop to ask what became of the men behind those guns, the faces who once ruled the frontier. Tonight, we pull back the curtain. We return to the dusty trails, not to watch the film, but to uncover the real lives, real ages, and the haunting fates that followed each of its stars. The truth is far darker than the movie ever showed. Steve McQueen as Vin Tanner, the rebel carved from fire. He entered the Magnificent Seven like a spark striking dry earth, unpredictable, magnetic, destined to blaze. As Vin Tanner, Steve McQueen didn't just act the role of a rebel gunslinger, he embodied it. Every glance, every smirk, every flick of his hat felt like a challenge thrown at the world. Audiences saw a man who feared nothing. They never saw what he was running from. McQueen carried a storm inside him. The scars of a childhood without a father, the hunger to outride anyone who dared share his spotlight, the restless energy that made him both brilliant and impossible to contain. Castmates whispered that he lived like a fuse burning on both ends, chasing danger the way other men chased comfort. But even legends face enemies they can't outrun. For McQueen, it was a silent one, a relentless cancer that crawled through his body, stealing breath, strength, and finally, time. The man who once moved like lightning across the frontier died quietly in a hospital room far from the wild terrain that made him famous. Vin Tanner was the rebel of the West. Steve McQueen was the rebel of life, and every flame eventually burns to its end. Yul Brynner as Chris Adams, the steel-hearted leader carved from legend. He didn't just ride into the Magnificent Seven, he commanded it. As Chris Adams, Yul Brynner became the center of gravity, the man whose presence bent the entire West around him. Bald, bold, impossibly composed, he looked like a leader forged in the fires of a dozen lifetimes. When he spoke, the world seemed to hold its breath. But behind the iconic silhouette was a life marked by exile, reinvention, and relentless ambition. Born in Vladivostok, shaped by struggle and sharpened by the stage, Brynner carried an intensity that co-stars described as both inspiring and intimidating. He expected perfection, from himself most of all. Every movement, every word, every stare was crafted with a precision that made him unforgettable. Yet even legends have weaknesses carved into their bones. For Brynner, it was the cigarette, the quiet addiction that followed him from youth to fame. Decades later, it returned for him with the cold certainty of fate. Lung cancer grew in the shadows, slowly taking away the power of a man who once seemed untouchable. He died in 1985 at just 65, leaving a warning recorded in his own words, "Don't smoke. Whatever you do, don't smoke." Chris Adams led men into battle. Yul Brynner led generations into myth until the fire that lit his legend finally consumed him. Rico Alanis as Sotero, the guardian born from dust and loyalty. He wasn't one of the seven, yet his presence grounded the entire story. As Sotero, the steadfast villager, Rico Alanis brought a quiet strength that felt carved from the very soil of the frontier. He was the man who stood his ground even when the world around him trembled, a reminder that bravery isn't always loud, and heroes aren't always the ones holding the guns. Alanis's journey to the screen was marked by the grit of a Mexican-born actor fighting for every opportunity in a Hollywood that rarely opened its doors. Colleagues remembered him as disciplined, warm, and deeply proud of the worlds he represented. On set, he was the anchor, the calm in a storm of larger-than-life personalities. And in life, he carried that same unshakable steadiness. No scandals, no tragedies born of fame, only time, moving slowly, weathering him like a lonely canyon stone. He lived to 95, passing away in 2015 of natural causes, a long, quiet exit fitting for a man who never sought the spotlight, only the truth in each role he played. Sotero stood for his people. Rico Alanis stood for dignity, the kind Hollywood notices only when it's gone. James Coburn as Brit, the silent lightning strike. He didn't need words to dominate a scene. Brit, the fastest, coldest, quietest blade in the Magnificent Seven. James Coburn moved like a man carved from wind and steel, every gesture sharp enough to cut the silence around him. While others swaggered, he simply existed, and somehow that was louder than any gunshot. On screen, he was a mystery wrapped in motion, the man who could kill with a knife before his enemy even drew breath. But behind that deadly grace was a life shaped by struggle. Coburn battled chronic pain for years, hiding it beneath a smile as unmistakable as the desert sun. Friends said he had a fire inside him, not loud, not wild, but fiercely controlled like dynamite waiting for a spark. And then, one November evening in 2002, the spark never came. A sudden heart attack ended his journey at 74, leaving behind a silence far heavier than the one he used to command on screen. The West lost its quiet storm, its deadly whisper of danger. In the film, Brit was the man no outlaw wanted to face. In life, James Coburn was the man who proved that even the strongest hearts can stop without warning. Brad Dexter as Harry Luck, the gambler chasing salvation. He rode into the Magnificent Seven with the swagger of a man who believed fortune was always just one step away. As Harry Luck, Brad Dexter played the charming opportunist, the gunfighter who smiled at danger because he thought destiny owed him a favor. To the audience, he was the bold one, the wheeler dealer, the man who gambled with his life like it was pocket change. But the truth behind that confidence was far more complicated. Dexter was a fighter off screen, too, a man who clawed his way through Hollywood's harsh terrain, never quite receiving the recognition he deserved. Friends whispered that he carried a restless hunger, always reaching for a success that stayed maddeningly out of reach. His charm wasn't an act, it was armor. And as fate would have it, his real-life ending mirrored the quiet tragedy of a gambler whose luck finally runs dry. In his later years, he was undone not by scandal or violence, but by the slow, suffocating grip of emphysema. Breath by breath, the world slipped further away until he passed in 2002 at the age of 85. Vladimir Sokoloff as the Old Man, the final voice of a fading world. He appeared in the Magnificent Seven not as a fighter, but as something far more powerful. The Old Man, the weary soul who carried the sorrow and hopes of an entire village in his trembling voice. Vladimir Sokoloff didn't just play wisdom, he was it. At more than 70 years old, he moved through the film like a living memory, a reminder of a world slipping quietly into history. Born in Moscow and shaped by revolutions, exile, and war, Sokoloff brought to the screen a depth no script could teach. Castmates said his eyes held stories from another century, stories of survival, loss, and resilience. When he spoke, even the gunfighters listened, as if time itself paused to hear him. But life, like the frontier, shows no mercy. Just 2 years after the film's release, a sudden stroke ended his long journey. One moment he was working, still carrying that ancient fire. The next, he was gone, taken in Hollywood, far from the empire where his story began. The old man reminded the villagers that farmers live on forever. Vladimir Sokoloff left behind his own quiet truth. Wisdom can guide a generation, but even the wisest hearts eventually fall silent. Charles Bronson as Bernardo O'Reilly, the Iron Warrior built from coal and silence. He entered the Magnificent Seven not as a star, but as a force, solid, unshakable, carved from the hard earth of Pennsylvania's coal mines. As Bernardo O'Reilly, Charles Bronson became the quiet protector, the man who spoke little yet carried the weight of the world in every step. Children in the film looked at him like he was made of steel, and in many ways he was. Bronson's life before Hollywood was a war of its own, one of 15 children, scraping through poverty, loading coal until his hands were raw. That brutality forged him into something audiences would later mistake for invincibility. Co-stars said he had a presence you could feel before you even saw him. A strength earned, not acted. But even iron rusts. In his later years, the man who embodied toughness was slowly unmade by one of the cruelest thieves of all, Alzheimer's. The disease stripped away memories, names, and finally the fire that had burned in him since childhood. After a painful decline and a failed hip surgery that only deepened his suffering, Bronson took his last breath in 2003 at Cedars-Sinai. Bernardo fought for the helpless. Bronson fought for himself until even the strongest warrior could fight no more. Horst Buchholz as Chico, the restless soul chasing glory. He burst into the Magnificent Seven like youth itself, wild, hopeful, reckless in all the ways only a 27-year-old can be. As Chico, Horst Buchholz became the heartbeat of the group, the young gunfighter desperate to prove he belonged among legends. When he laughed, the frontier felt alive. When he fought, it felt like the West had found its future. But behind that vibrant energy lay a man who never stopped running. Buchholz carried an ambition that burned hotter than anyone realized, a hunger for roles, recognition, and a place at the top of Hollywood's unforgiving ladder. Friends said he lived with the intensity of someone who feared being forgotten, even at the height of his fame. And then, fate struck with the cruelty of a bullet fired from nowhere. A simple hip injury, a surgery meant to heal. And suddenly, pneumonia tightened around him like an invisible rope. The man who once seemed destined for decades of stardom was gone at 69, taken not by scandal or old age, but by a quiet, tragic twist of medicine. Chico dreamed of becoming a hero. Horst Buchholz died as a reminder that even the brightest flames can be extinguished without warning. Rosenda Monteros as Petra, the quiet heartbeat of a dying village. She appeared in the Magnificent Seven, like a breeze crossing the dusty fields, soft, tender, almost too pure for a world ruled by guns. As Petra, Rosenda Monteros became the quiet soul of the story, the woman whose eyes held both fear and fierce hope. She wasn't one of the seven, yet somehow she carried the emotional weight of an entire village. On screen, she was light. But behind the camera, Monteros was a storm of passion and discipline, a young actress from Veracruz determined to carve her place in an industry that rarely made room for women like her. Colleagues said she carried a sweetness that hid a spine of steel, a rare balance that made her unforgettable. And then, as the decades passed, she slipped away from the spotlight with the same gentleness she brought to Petra. No scandals, no noise, just a gradual fading, like the last note of a song no one wanted to end. When she died in 2018 at the age of 83, it felt less like a departure and more like the closing of a chapter we'd forgotten to reread. Petra was the heart of the village. Rosenda Monteros was the heart of its memory, soft, steady, impossible to replace. Robert Vaughn as Lee, the warrior shaped by solitude. He stepped into the Magnificent Seven with a quiet intensity that felt impossible to ignore. As Lee, Robert Vaughn carried a calm so sharp it almost cut through the dust-filled air, a calm that made audiences believe he was the most controlled man in the West. But that composure was a mask, both on screen and off. Behind his steady eyes lived a man wrestling with pressures no camera ever captured. Vaughn understood fear in a way few actors did. He played it not with trembling hands, but with silence, the kind that reveals more than words ever could. Those who worked beside him said he always seemed to be listening to something distant, something only he could hear. And while his character stood tall among 6 other legends, Vaughn himself walked a quieter, more fragile path. His final years became a battle of their own, a long and lonely fight against illness that dimmed even the strongest parts of him. Lee taught us that courage can be quiet. Vaughn proved it. Robert J. Wilke as Wallace, the shadow carved from iron. He was never meant to be a hero, not on screen, not in the ruthless world of westerns. As Wallace, Robert J. Wilke carried the presence of a man shaped by hard roads and harder choices. He had one of those faces, sharp, weathered, unmistakably dangerous. The kind of face Hollywood loved to cast in the shadows. And Wilke embraced it, turning every glance, every quiet threat into something unforgettable. Behind the scenes, he was the opposite of the villains he portrayed. Colleagues remembered him as gentle, loyal, even shy, a man who slipped into darkness only when the cameras demanded it. Yet being typecast weighed on him. He often joked that the West would collapse if he ever stopped playing the bad guy. But no one outruns fate, not even the strongest silhouettes. In 1989, after decades of working, writing, and carving out a legacy in the dust, Wilke faced a foe no stuntman could fight: cancer. It spread quietly, steadily, stealing his strength the way his characters once had their humanity stolen by circumstance. He died at 74, far from the gunfights and dusty towns that made his name familiar to generations of Western fans. On screen, Wallace was the threat in the doorway. In life, Robert J. Wilke was proof that even the darkest characters can come from the kindest souls. Eli Wallach as Calvera, the smiling villain who stole the screen. He rode into the Magnificent Seven not as a hero, but as its heartbeat of danger. As Calvera, Eli Wallach turned a bandit leader into something far more unforgettable, a villain with a grin sharp enough to cut through fear. He didn't just threaten the village, he owned every frame he touched, moving with the unpredictable swagger of a man who believed the world was his to plunder. But off-screen, Wallach was nothing like the outlaw he portrayed. He was trained, thoughtful, a craftsman of emotion who could slip from charm to menace with a single glance. Directors loved him, actors admired him, audiences feared him. All for the same reason, nobody played darkness with as much brilliance. And yet, life wrote him a far gentler ending than the villain he embodied. Wallach aged quietly, gracefully, continuing to work, to act, to live with the same fire that had carried him across decades of storytelling. When he finally passed away in 2014 at the age of 98, it felt as though one of cinema's last great shadows had finally dimmed. Calvera was the storm that haunted the horizon. Eli Wallach was the artist who proved that even villains can burn brighter than the heroes they face. Bing Russell as Robert, the quiet watchman of a brutal frontier. He wasn't the fastest gun nor the loudest voice in the Magnificent Seven, but Robert, played by Bing Russell, carried a presence you couldn't ignore. He was the kind of man you'd see standing at the edge of a dusty street, alert, steady, watching everything even when he spoke nothing. Russell brought to the role a truthfulness that made the West feel real, as if he'd lived its dangers long before the cameras began to roll. Off-screen, he was known for that same grounded strength. A working man's actor, a figure who built his legacy not on fame, but on commitment. Colleagues remembered him as generous, humble, and fiercely devoted to the craft, never chasing the spotlight but always elevating the story around him. Yet life has a way of striking hardest at the gentle souls. In 2003, cancer took hold, dragging him into a fight no frontier courage could withstand. He passed away at 76, leaving behind a legacy that stretched far beyond one film. A legacy later carried forward by his son, Kurt Russell, who grew up watching his father carve a place in Hollywood, one quiet role at a time. On screen, Robert was the man who watched danger approach. In life, Bing Russell was the man who faced it with dignity until the very end.